Now let's bring this back into something that's manageable in the life drawing classroom. Here's a demonstration that I did for my students under these kinds of ambient, indirect life drawing conditions that we've been talking about. So you see, I can zoom in. The top planes, the planes that are facing most upward, the cheeks, here in the brow where it's not getting a drop shadow from the hair, the bridge of the nose, these big broad planes that are facing up get the light, but then as the form turns under, it simply goes from lighter to a little darker, then this form turns back out, so it gets a little lighter again, then it turns under and gets darker. Real simple, folks. And we need to always keep our eye on the ball. So here's the challenge that happened with my students, something that they struggled with. We have these little bits of forms here. Right here on this model, that form turned back out and caught a little light. Here, the chin. What I saw almost everybody doing was over-rendering, over-exaggerating the contrast. We've talked about this. We know about this. They knew about it. They knew to watch out for it. And yet it's so alluring and tempting to over-render. Even the best of us have to stay constantly vigilant. And so here's what happened. They saw, for instance, this chin. Well, that chin right there being surrounded by all of these darks, oh my gosh, it felt bright. It just felt so bright. And so dutifully, most of them rendered it exactly how they saw it. They saw it as being very bright, and so they rendered it as being very bright. They're drawing along until all of a sudden they sense a presence behind them. Me, standing looking over their shoulder. And so they kind of nervously, kind of glance back and maybe keep drawing. I just stand there for just a couple seconds, long enough until they feel uncomfortable. And then I say, why did you draw the highlight on the chin brighter than you drew the highlight on the cheeks and on the bridge of the nose? And they stopped, took a look at it, maybe they squinted to do the value relationship thing that we always talk about, and then they said, oh shoot, I did exactly what we've been talking about since day one of class, what not to do. I got caught up in individual contrasts rather than making sure that those contrasts were hierarchical, that those contrasts were relative to all of the other contrasts. In this particular case, under this particular lighting, the brightest lights were these big broad planes that face up. These areas turned more and more under. Sure, there was a fairly bright highlight on the chin. It was not as bright as the highlights happening here. I want this to be a reminder to you guys to always stay vigilant about value hierarchy. These individual contrasts that are surrounded by dark constantly want to fool it, but that's what the amateurs do. We cannot let it be what we do. So my step-by-step process with this will be familiar to you, a construction drawing that emphasizes how those parts relate to the whole and the three-dimensional nature of the subject. I like to work like this. With my technique, as we've discussed many times, you don't have to follow exactly my process, but the way that I tend to push tones around, establishing my features and where the darks are tends to be helpful for me. But in this stage, I'm carefully rendering the broad strokes, the big masses of light, and then suggesting where they curve around into shadow. Next, pushing and pulling, finding the softly turning forms and the big masses. Now I start to render. I find those variations. I'm using a charcoal pencil. I'm using my Pitt brand, P-I-T-T, in your materials list. I'm using that pencil because it feels about the same as the compressed charcoal in the nature of its charcoal lead. I'm also using a kneaded eraser to pick out some of the highlights, pushing and pulling, bringing that bad boy, or bad girl as we might say, to a finish here. Softly rendered tones with an ambient, bright but indirect light coming straight down from above. And I want to point out, as crude as this stage of the drawing might be, I feel that in our value steps, in our light and shadow steps, this is actually the most important step here, because it establishes the big broad strokes, the masses of light and shadow that keep the forms organized. This is the stage and the step that lets me get accurately to this one. So I want to thank Scott Burdick for giving me permission to refer to some of his beautiful work, and you can see more of it at scottburdick.com. I want to again thank Morgan Weisling for permission to reference his work, which can be viewed at morganweisling.com, which brings us right to your homework.